History speaks loudly. It echoes with the clash of swords, the thunder of hooves, the declarations of kings carved into stone. But beyond that noise, beyond the banners and crowns, there's another current, quieter, steadier. Have we mistaken silence for absence? Have we assumed that because women did not always sit upon thrones, they did not shape the world? Tonight, we lift the veil, not to rewrite history, not to argue with it, but to walk softly through it. And notice what was always there. Welcome, dear historian. Tonight, we journey gently across centuries, from the first seeds planted in ancient soil, to candlelit desks where arguments for women's education were carefully written. If you are new here, I invite you to subscribe and join our growing circle of listeners who find rest in the quieter corners of history. Now, let us begin. Long before castles, long before empires, there were valleys, mist rising slowly from damp earth, small clusters of homes, built from mud, brick, and timber, gathered beside rivers that flooded gently each spring. This was the beginning of settled life. The Neolithic Age. An age of seeds. Here, survival depended not on conquest, but on cultivation. Fields had to be cleared, grain planted, harvest gathered before frost. Archaeological evidence suggests that women played central roles in early agriculture, tending crops, processing grain, storing food for winter. Grinding stones worn smooth by centuries of hands still remain. Their surfaces speak of repetition, of daily labor, of quiet endurance. In these early communities, hierarchy appears less rigid than in later empires. Graves do not always show dramatic differences in wealth between men and women. Labor was shared. Survival required cooperation. And with cooperation came a form of influence rooted in necessity. Women were not spectators in these early settlements. They were seed keepers, food preservers, mothers of generations who would carry farming knowledge forward. Their rights were not written in law codes, because law codes did not yet exist, but their roles were woven into survival itself. And survival, in those early centuries, was power. As agriculture stabilized communities, something else grew alongside it. Symbol. Across ancient sites, archaeologists have uncovered small clay figurines, often depicting female forms, rounded hips, full bellies, calm expressions. Scholars debate their precise meaning. Were they goddesses? Symbols of fertility? Representations of motherhood? We cannot know with certainty, but their presence across regions suggests reverence for the life-giving body. The earth produced crops. Women produced children. Both were linked in imagination and in reverence. In this era, spiritual symbolism appears deeply connected to women's roles. Not dominance, not rule, but sacred association. It was not yet a world of written rights, but it was a world where women's life-giving capacity was central to communal survival and belief. As centuries passed, settlements grew larger, trade routes extended, metals were shaped into tools, and later, into weapons. With growth came structure. With structure came hierarchy. Roles that had once been fluid began to formalize. Authority slowly concentrated. The communal village would, in time, give way to palace complexes. Sacred figurines would share space with monumental architecture, and the world would grow louder. But beneath those changes, something endured. The memory of shared survival, the rhythm of planting and harvest, the understanding that society depends not only on those who command, but on those who sustain. Rest for a moment in that early valley. Hear wind move through grain. Feel sun warming stone. As small farming villages expanded, some communities grew into organized civilizations. Trade increased. Architecture became more complex. Art developed detail and symbolism. In the Bronze Age, societies around the Mediterranean began constructing large palace centers, developing writing systems, and forming structured religious traditions. Among these early civilizations, one stands out for the way women appear in its art. On the island of Minoan Crete, flourishing roughly between 2000 and 1450 BCE. Palace walls were painted with vivid In these paintings, women are not hidden in the background. They are central figures. They participate in ceremonies. They stand prominently in ritual scenes. They wear elaborate clothing and jewelry. Some figures hold serpents, symbols often associated with renewal and life. Scholars continue to debate the structure of Minoan society. Was it matriarchal? Was inheritance passed through the female line? Or was it simply a society where women held visible religious authority? The evidence does not give a complete answer. But what is clear is this: women were represented publicly and respectfully in sacred imagery. That visibility matters. In many later societies, religious authority became increasingly in Minoan art, however, women appear to occupy important ceremonial roles. If religious life shaped social hierarchy, and it often did, then participation in ritual life carried influence. Even if we cannot measure that influence precisely, sacred roles and social meaning in early civilizations, religion was not separate from daily life. It guided agricultural cycles, festivals, law, and leadership. If women were central in religious ceremonies, then their roles were woven into the cultural framework of society. This does not necessarily mean equal political power, but it does suggest recognized spiritual presence. Across other ancient regions, from Anatolia to Mesopotamia, female deities also held important positions in myth. Goddesses represented fertility, wisdom, war, and protection. In symbolic terms, feminine power was acknowledged, yet symbolism and legal authority are not always the same. As societies grew more structured, legal codes began to appear, and written law changes everything. The emergence of law with the rise of larger states came written rules governing inheritance, property, and marriage. Unlike the earlier village societies, rights could now be defined and restricted in formal language. In some early law codes of the ancient Near East, women could own property and conduct business under certain conditions. In other cases, marriage contracts placed them under male guardianship. The pattern becomes clearer as we move forward in time. As societies centralized power, authority became more formally structured. Public leadership roles increasingly favored men. Women's participation became more defined, sometimes protected, sometimes limited. The shift was gradual. There was no single turning point. But over centuries, the world moved from shared agrarian survival toward stratified political systems. Visibility and transition. The Bronze Age world was not uniform. Different regions developed differently. Some societies offered women relative flexibility in property ownership. Others imposed stricter control. But overall, we begin to see a pattern. Spiritual visibility could coexist with legal limitation. Women might be honored in ritual, yet restricted in civic life. That tension would echo through centuries. As we leave the painted walls of Crete and the symbolic world of goddess imagery, we move toward empires that left detailed written records. In those records, we will see more clearly how rights were structured and how roles adapted within those structures. As Bronze Age civilizations declined and new powers rose, one empire would come to dominate much of Europe and the Mediterranean: Rome. Rome built roads that stretched for thousands of miles. It constructed cities with forums, baths, and amphitheaters. It developed legal systems that influenced future generations. And unlike earlier societies where evidence survives mostly in art and ruins, Rome left detailed written records. With Rome, we begin to see clearly how women's rights were defined in law. At the center of the Roman household stood the paterfamilias, the senior male. Under Roman law, he held authority over family members, including his wife and children. In theory, this authority was extensive. In practice, daily life was more complex. Over time, Roman women, especially those of higher status, gained certain legal freedoms. By the late Republic and early Empire, many women could own property, inherit wealth, manage estates, conduct business transactions. Marriage laws evolved. Some forms of marriage placed women under the legal control of their husbands. Other forms allowed women to remain legally tied to their father's family, preserving independent property rights. These distinctions mattered because property is security, and legal recognition of property ownership is a measurable right. The Roman matron in Roman society The ideal upper-class woman was the matrona, dignified, modest, responsible. She oversaw the household. But a Roman household was not small. It could include servants, enslaved workers, agricultural laborers, extended family. Managing such a household required administrative skill. Some women supervised large estates while their husbands traveled for military or political duties. Letters preserved from the period show women managing finances, resolving disputes, and making practical decisions. They were excluded from holding public political office. They did not vote. But influence was not absent. It operated differently. Through family networks, through patronage, through strategic marriage alliances, through advisory roles behind closed doors. Again, we see a familiar pattern. Formal, public power restricted. Practical, domestic, and economic authority active. Visibility in culture. Roman art and literature depict women in various roles. Some frescoes show women reading or writing. Others portray priestesses serving in religious rituals. The Vestal Virgins, for example, held a unique position. They were priestesses dedicated to maintaining Rome as a sacred fire. They took vows of chastity and were granted privileges uncommon for women of the time, including control over their own property. Their status demonstrates something important. Even within structured legal systems, exceptions exist. Religious authority could grant autonomy, but such roles were rare and highly regulated. Rights and restrictions. Roman law also included restrictions. Women generally required a male guardian for certain legal transactions, though this requirement weakened over time. Social expectations emphasized modesty and loyalty to family. Public leadership roles remained yet compared to some later periods, Roman women, especially wealthy ones, could exercise notable economic freedom. This is important to remember. History is not a straight line of progress or decline. In some areas, rights expanded. In others, they narrowed. As Rome grew powerful, so too did its administrative systems. But no empire remains unchanged. Over centuries, internal conflict, economic strain, and external pressures reshaped Roman society, and alongside political change came religious transformation. The next shift would influence women's roles in a different way, not through imperial law, but through spiritual community. We now move into late antiquity, where Christianity emerged, and new forms of authority began to take shape. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Roman world was transforming. Political instability increased, borders were pressured, economic systems strained. At the same time, a religious movement that had begun quietly in small gatherings was spreading across cities and provinces. Christianity. In its earliest form, Christianity often met in private homes. These gatherings were not grand public ceremonies. They were intimate. Meals shared, scripture read aloud, prayers spoken together. In several early Christian communities, women appear in historical records as patrons, hosting assemblies in their homes, supporting traveling teachers, and contributing resources. Hospitality mattered, and a home large enough to host a gathering suggested influence. In these early decades, roles were not yet fully institutionalized. Leadership structures were still forming. Women could participate visibly within these small communities. But as Christianity expanded, and especially after it became legally recognized within the Roman Empire, organization increased, hierarchy developed, titles were formalized, clergy roles became more clearly defined, and increasingly, those formal leadership roles were reserved for men. This was not an abrupt change. It was gradual. As religious institutions solidified, authority became structured, much like political authority had before. New paths of devotion, even as official leadership narrowed. Women found alternative paths within the growing Christian world. Some chose lives of ascetic devotion. In Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean, women joined communities devoted to prayer, simplicity, and discipline. Others became widows who dedicated themselves to charitable work and religious study. A new form of authority emerged, spiritual dedication rather than civic office. Holiness carried weight. Reputation for wisdom and piety could grant influence that law did not formally provide. Letters from this period reveal women advising bishops, supporting theological communities, and shaping religious life indirectly. The birth of monastic life as the Western Roman Empire weakened in the 5th century. Political structures fragmented, cities shrunk, trade networks contracted. In this uncertain environment, monastic communities offered stability. Men and women withdrew from urban life to form structured religious houses devoted to prayer and work. For women, convents would become one of the most significant institutions of the medieval world. Within convent walls, women could receive education, learn to read and write, manage land and property granted to the institution, exercise authority over other members while they remained under the broader authority of the church. Convent life created space for literacy and leadership unavailable in many other settings. This shift is important, as public civic rights narrowed with the decline of Rome. Spiritual communities opened new roles, not equal roles, not identical to male monastic leadership, but real, structured responsibility. A world in transition. Late antiquity was a bridge between worlds. The classical structures of Rome did not disappear overnight. They transformed. Germanic kingdoms formed in former Roman territories. Local customs mixed with inherited Roman law. The church grew in influence, and gradually, the foundations of medieval Europe were laid. For women, this was not a simple story of loss or gain. Some legal freedoms available in late Roman society diminished in certain regions. Guardianship rules tightened in some kingdoms. In other areas, customary laws allowed women to inherit property under defined conditions. But one consistent pattern remains. When centralized political systems weakened, family and household structures became even more important. And within those households, women continued to manage daily survival. As we step fully into the medieval centuries, we will see how these patterns solidified. Stone castles rose. Feudal obligations formed. Church institutions expanded. And within those frameworks, women adapted, sometimes constrained, sometimes empowered, often both at once. We now enter the medieval world proper. The bell of the cloister rings at dawn. By the early medieval period, Europe had become a landscape of small kingdoms, rural villages, and growing church influence. Political power was unstable in many regions, but one institution remained steady: the monastery. Monasteries and convents became centers of learning, agriculture, and spiritual life. They followed structured daily routines, prayer at set hours, work in fields or workshops, reading and copying texts. For women, the convent offered something rare in medieval society: an organized community where literacy was possible. A convent was not simply a place of prayer, it was an institution. Many convents owned land. They collected rents from tenant farmers. They managed agricultural production. The woman in charge, the abbess, held real administrative authority. She supervised finances. She corresponded with bishops and local rulers. She oversaw discipline within the community. While she did not stand above male church hierarchy, within her domain she exercised structured leadership. That distinction matters. Her authority was recognized and documented. Literacy as power. In a world where most people could not read, literacy was significant. Convents provided education for girls from noble families. Some women entered convents by choice. Others were sent by families seeking spiritual prestige or economic stability. Inside the cloister, women learned Latin, religious texts, manuscript copying, music, and chant. Copying manuscripts required patience and precision. Each page was prepared by hand. Ink mixed carefully. Gold leaf applied slowly. Texts preserved in these scriptoria would survive for centuries. Literacy did not grant political office, but it did grant intellectual agency. Women in convents could write letters, record events, and in rare cases compose original works. One well-known example is Hildegard of Bingen. Living in the 12th century, Hildegard became abbess of her community. She wrote theological works, composed music, and corresponded with powerful figures, including emperors and church leaders. Her influence did not come from military command. It came from recognized spiritual authority and intellectual contribution. She worked within church structure, not outside it. And within that structure, she shaped discourse. rights within limits, it is important to understand the balance here. Convents did not create equality between men and women in medieval society. Women in religious life remained under broader church authority. Major church offices were reserved for men. Yet compared to many laywomen of the period, nuns and abbesses often experienced greater access to education, administrative responsibility, economic oversight, recognized community leadership. This is one of the recurring themes of history. When one avenue of authority narrows, another sometimes opens. In earlier centuries, women may have exercised broader economic rights in Roman households. In the medieval world, literacy and land management through religious institutions became an alternative space of influence. Stability in uncertain times. It included famine, war, political conflict, and shifting borders. But convents often served as stable anchors within communities. They provided charity. They offered education. They preserved texts. They acted as economic hubs. Within their walls, women's roles were defined, not invisible. Structured, not informal. Limited, yet meaningful. As the Middle Ages progressed, other spaces of female authority would appear as well. Not within cloister walls, but within castles, within manors, within the economic life of villages. The next chapter takes us there, to the great estates of feudal Europe, where noble women governed in the absence of their lords. The medieval world expands, and so do the forms of women's responsibility within it. By the High Middle Ages, Europe had become organized under feudal systems. Land was the foundation of power. Kings granted territories to nobles. Nobles pledged loyalty in return. Peasants worked the land under obligation. The castle was not only a symbol of strength, it was an administrative center. And within that system, the role of a noblewoman, particularly a wife of a lord, carried defined responsibility. For marriage among the nobility was rarely based solely on affection. It was political. It secured alliances. It transferred land. It strengthened claims. A noblewoman often brought property or dowry into marriage. In some regions, she retained certain rights to that property. In others, her assets came under her husband's control. Legal customs varied across medieval Europe, but one reality was consistent. The lord of the manor was frequently absent. He might be engaged in warfare, attending court, traveling between estates. During these absences, the responsibility of management did not disappear. It shifted to his wife. Estate management was a working system. Fields required supervision. Harvests required coordination. Storage barns required protection. Disputes among tenants had to be resolved. Rents collected, supplies accounted for. In records that survive from medieval estates, we find women issuing instructions, approving expenses, and supervising agricultural production. This was not symbolic authority. It was practical governance. Some noblewomen acted as regents when husbands died and sons were still minors. In such cases, they exercised temporary, but recognized political authority. They oversaw legal matters, negotiated alliances, maintained stability. Again, their power was usually framed as guardianship on behalf of sons or estates. But guardianship still required decision. Rights and constraints. Medieval law placed women under various forms of male guardianship, depending on region and class. Marriage typically altered a woman's legal identity. In many areas, widows held greater legal freedom than married women. A widow might control her dower land's property designated for her support. She could manage estates independently. In some cases, she chose not to remarry to preserve that autonomy. This is another recurring pattern in history. Legal status shifted with marital condition. Maiden, wife, widow. Each carried different rights. None fully equal to male counterparts, but none entirely powerless. The castle, as household and court life inside a medieval castle, was not constant battle preparation. It was structured routine. The lady of the manor oversaw food storage and distribution, textile production, household staff, guest hospitality. Textile work, particularly weaving and embroidery, was both domestic and economic. Fine cloth had value. Producing it contributed to household wealth. The noblewoman also played an important social role. She received guests, maintained alliances, corresponded with relatives and neighboring lords. Letters from medieval noblewomen reveal negotiation skills and political awareness. Influence did not always appear in formal law codes. It often appeared in preserved correspondence. Authority in absence when conflict arose, and it often did. Some noblewomen took on defensive leadership. Historical accounts describe women organizing castle defenses during sieges. They directed supplies, maintained morale, negotiated terms when necessary. Such actions were not the norm, but they were not unheard of. In moments of crisis, necessity overrode custom. Responsibility expanded. As we move forward, we will look more closely at those moments of crisis. Times when the expected boundaries of women's roles stretched under pressure. But before that, we must understand something essential. In feudal society, land was wealth, and managing land meant managing survival. When noblewomen governed estates, even temporarily, they exercised meaningful authority within the framework of medieval law. Limited, conditional, but real. The medieval world was structured. Yet within its structure, women adapted to the spaces available. Medieval Europe was not peaceful for long stretches. Border disputes, succession conflicts, regional rivalries, and foreign invasions were common. Castles were not built for decoration. They were built for defense. Thick stone walls, narrow windows. High towers for observation. And when danger approached, leadership became urgent. In many cases, the lord of the castle was absent, fighting elsewhere or serving as king. When that happened, someone had to assume command. Sometimes, that responsibility fell to his wife. Defense, a Zutida, medieval noblewoman, was not trained primarily as a soldier, but she understood the structure of the estate. She knew its stores of grain, its water sources, its loyal retainers. During a siege, survival depended on organization. Supplies had to be rationed. Water protected, morale maintained. Chroniclers record several instances where women directed defensive efforts. They supervised guards, coordinated provisions, oversaw repairs to damaged sections of wall. These actions did not rewrite medieval gender norms, but they reveal something important. In crisis, competence mattered more than custom. Authority expanded when necessity demanded it. Temporis eventi, when a nobleman died in battle, and his heir was still a child, a widow could serve as regent. In that role, she governed the estate until her son reached maturity. This was not symbolic. Regency included supervising legal disputes, negotiating alliances, protecting territorial claims. Managing armed retainers, her authority was officially recognized, though often described as temporary and tied to maternal duty. Still, Regency granted access to political decisions. It demonstrated that women could administer territory when circumstances required. Rights were conditional. Authority framed as guardianship, yet the practical responsibilities were substantial. The balance between expectation and reality. Medieval law and custom emphasized male leadership in warfare and politics, but medieval life did not unfold according to theory alone. Travel was low, communication uncertain. Power was decentralized. Local leadership often depended on whoever was physically present and capable. In such environments, noblewomen became stabilizing figures. They ensured continuity of rule. They prevented chaos during absence. They maintained loyalty among tenants and knights. While they were rarely granted long-term sovereign rule in their own names, their capacity to govern was acknowledged in moments of transition. Again, the pattern appears. Formal rights restricted. Practical authority exercised. Influence beyond the battlefield, not all. Crises involved siege. Political conflict could unfold through negotiation rather than war. Marriage alliances, arranged by noble women, shaped the political landscape. Correspondence between noble families often relied on women as intermediaries. A letter carried across territory could prevent violence or tricher italiano. Women who maintained networks across regions sometimes acted as diplomatic links between houses. This influence was rarely recorded as official power, but it shaped outcomes. Rights and context. It is important not to overstate the scope of this authority. Most medieval women, particularly peasants, did not command castles. Their lives were defined by agricultural labor and household responsibility. But among the nobility, we see that women's roles included estate governance, regency crisis management, diplomatic communication. These roles existed within a framework that limited formal equality. Yet they demonstrate capacity. They show adaptation within structure. As medieval society stabilized in some regions and grew economically in others, daily life beyond castles also evolved. The next chapter moves away from stone fortresses into villages, into homes, into the economic center of medieval survival, the hearth. Their authority looked different, less dramatic, but equally essential. Most medieval women did not live in castles or convents. They lived in villages, in timber-framed houses with thatched roofs, in small communities where daily survival depended on steady work. The medieval economy was not only fields and feudal contracts, it was also household production. Inside a typical village home, a central hearth provided heat and light. Around it, much of daily labor took place. Spinning wool into thread was constant work. Thread became cloth. Cloth became clothing, blankets, sacks, and goods for trade. Textiles were valuable. In many regions, cloth production formed a significant part of the local economy. Women's labor sustained it. Spinning was repetitive but essential. The sound of the spindle turning was as common as birds outside the door. This work did not appear in legal codes, but it sustained trade networks. Brewing and food production. Ale was safer to drink than untreated water. Brewing was often women's responsibility. Grain was soaked, fermented, and stored carefully. In somatones, women sold surplus ale in local markets. This gave them small but meaningful participation in the money economy. Food preservation was equally important. Cheese making, drying herbs, salting meat, preparing bread. Each task required knowledge. Mistakes could mean hunger. Competence meant stability. In many households, women controlled these processes. Authority at the hearth was not ceremonial. It was practical. Market participation. As towns expanded during the High Middle Ages, local markets became regular features of economic life. Women appeared there not only as buyers, but as sellers. They sold cloth, dairy products, vegetables, ale. In some cities, women joined guild-related trades, particularly in textile industries. Guild membership rules varied. In some regions, widows could continue their husbands' businesses. In others, women operated in informal trade networks. Legal structures often favored male guild masters, yet economic participation was not entirely closed. The pattern remains consistent. Formal authority limited, economic contribution constant. Property and custom. Medieval inheritance laws differed across Europe. In some regions, daughters could inherit property if there were no sons. In others, land passed strictly through male lines. Dowry systems transferred wealth at marriage, but control over that wealth varied. Widows again occupied a unique position. In many places, a widow was entitled to a portion of her husband's estate, known as dower rights. This allowed her financial security and some degree of independence. Widowhood, while often emotionally and economically difficult, sometimes granted greater legal standing than marriage had. These distinctions shaped women's lived experience. Rights were conditional, dependent on status, location, and marital state. The household as economic center. The medieval household was not simply a private domestic space. It was a unit of production. Men and women worked together in fields, but within the home, women directed processes essential to survival: clothing, production, food storage, child rearing, herbal remedies, financial management of small transactions. This authority rarely appeared in chronicles. Yet without it, villages would not function. The economic life of medieval Europe depended on this shared labor, and women's participation was constant. Continuity across generations. Perhaps the most enduring role was transmission. Skills passed from mother to daughter. Recipes memorized. Techniques demonstrated repeatedly. Knowledge moved through observation and repetition. This was education, even if not formal schooling. The right to hold office may have been restricted, but the role of preserving practical knowledge remained secure. As medieval society continued to develop, some towns grew wealthier, trade expanded. Urban life created new possibilities and new restrictions, but alongside economic change, another quiet authority operated within communities. Midwives, healers, women whose expertise centered on birth and health. The next chapter enters that space, a different kind of authority, one built on trust. In medieval villages and towns, there were few formally trained physicians. Medical knowledge existed, but it was limited, expensive, and often distant from rural communities. For most people, healthcare began at home, and when childbirth approached, the most important figure was not a lord or a priest. It was the midwife. Midwives were experienced women who had attended many births. They learned through observation and apprenticeship rather than formal university study. Their knowledge included recognizing stages of labor, using herbal preparations, calming mothers during delivery, caring for newborns in a world where childbirth carried significant risk. This expertise was essential. Authority built on trust. Midwives did not hold official political power. They were not part of formal governance. Yet within their communities, they carried authority grounded in experience. Families trusted them. They were called into homes at vulnerable moments. They made decisions that could mean life or death. That kind of responsibility creates influence, even without legal title. In some regions, midwives were required to swear oaths before local authorities or church officials, promising to perform their duties faithfully. This formal recognition demonstrates something important. Their role was acknowledged as socially significant, even regulated. Herbal knowledge. Medical practice in the medieval world relied heavily on plants. Herbal remedies were common. Women often gathered, dried, and stored medicinal herbs. They learned which plants eased fever, which soothed digestive illness, which calmed anxiety. Some of this knowledge came from classical medical texts preserved in monasteries. Much of it came from tradition passed through generations. Oral transmission was central. Recipes memorized. Measurements approximated. Techniques refined over time. In many communities, women were the primary carriers of this practical medical knowledge. Limits and risks. Authority in healing, however, was not without risk. As medieval society evolved, especially in later centuries, suspicions sometimes fell upon women whose knowledge was not formally sanctioned. In earlier periods, midwifery was widely accepted. But over time, tensions between informal healing practices and institutional medicine increased. Still, throughout much of the medieval era, the midwife remained a respected community figure. Her authority was practical, localized, essential. Education outside. Institutions. Universities began to form in the High Middle Ages. These institutions trained male physicians in formal medical theory. Women were excluded from university education. This meant that formal, academic medicine became increasingly but practical household medicine remained within women's domain. This created a division. Official knowledge, written, taught in Latin, structured within institutions. Practical knowledge, spoken, demonstrated, rooted in lived experience. Both shaped medieval health, but only one was recognized in formal academic structures. Again, the pattern appears. Institutional rights limited. Community roles. Enduring guardians of continuity. Midwives did more than assist in childbirth. They were witnesses to lineage. They ensured safe arrival of heirs. They helped maintain population stability in small communities. Without their work, families could not continue. In societies where inheritance and succession mattered deeply, birth was not only a private event. It had social and economic implications. The woman attending that birth held responsibility that extended beyond the room. Her role may not appear in royal chronicles, but it shaped generations. As medieval society matured, influence operated across many layers. Within cloisters, within castles, within cottages, within birthing rooms. Each role reflected the structure of its time. Rights remained uneven. Authority often conditional, but participation was constant. The next chapter moves upward again, from village hearths to royal courts, two queens and mothers whose influence extended across kingdoms. A different scale, but the same pattern of structured limitation and practical impact. At the highest levels of medieval society stood the royal court. Kings ruled territories. They commanded armies. They issued charters and decrees. But monarchy was not sustained by one person alone. Dynasties depended on marriage, heirs, and alliances. And in these areas, queens and royal mothers played essential roles. A medieval queen's position was defined first by marriage. Royal marriages were political agreements. They secured peace treaties, strengthened territorial claims, united rival houses. A queen often arrived in a foreign court as part of diplomatic negotiation. Her role was not symbolic. She represented an alliance, the queen consortess. Queen consortess. Her formal authority was limited. She did not usually rule independently, yet her responsibilities were significant. She managed the royal household, oversaw court ceremony, distributed patronage, supported religious institutions. Her court could become a center of influence in its own right. Through patronage, supporting monasteries, artists, or scholars, she shaped cultural life. Through correspondence with her natal family, she maintained diplomatic connections between kingdoms. These networks could influence political decisions, even when not visible in official records. The Queen Mother, when a king died and his heir was underage, the Queen Mother sometimes acted as regent. In that role, she governed until her son reached maturity. Regency was not guaranteed. It depended on political conditions and support from nobles. But when it occurred, it granted direct authority. A regent presided over councils, approved financial expenditures, managed military defense, negotiated with rival factions. Her authority was usually framed as protection of her son's inheritance. Still, the decisions she made affected entire kingdoms. Again, authority was conditional, but real. Influence through succession. Medieval politics often centered on succession. Who would inherit? Which marriage would secure stability? Queens and royal mothers frequently shaped these outcomes. They arranged marriages for daughters and sons. They advised heirs. They mediated disputes among nobles. Letters written by medieval queens reveal strategic thinking. They requested military support, negotiated prisoner releases, secured alliances. Though formal law excluded them from kingship in most regions, their advisory role could shape policy. Limits of sovereignty. There were rare cases of women ruling as queens in their own right, but these cases often faced resistance. Medieval political theory generally favored male rulers. Even when women inherited thrones, their authority was frequently challenged. This demonstrates a consistent pattern in the evolution of rights. High visibility did not always equal full acceptance. Women could exercise authority, but their legitimacy was often debated, their power scrutinized more intensely than that of male rulers. The balance of structure and agency. Royal women occupied one of the most complex positions in medieval society. They were politically significant, economically influential, diplomatically active, yet also constrained by expectations of obedience and modesty. Their authority flowed through marriage, motherhood, guardianship, patronage. The medieval world was layered. At the top stood crowns. In villages, hearths. In cloisters, prayer halls. Across each layer, women's roles differed, but participation never disappeared. As we move beyond the medieval centuries, Europe will change again. Trade will expand. Printing will spread ideas more widely. Education will slowly become more accessible. And new conversations about rights will begin to emerge. By the late medieval period, Europe was changing again. Trade routes connected distant cities. Towns grew larger. Merchant classes gained influence. And in the 15th century, a technological shift began that would alter the spread of knowledge. The printing press, with movable type, books could be produced more quickly and in greater numbers than ever before. Texts that once required months of hand copying could now be printed in multiple copies. Literacy began to matter in new ways. For 4 centuries, education had been concentrated in monasteries, cathedral schools, and later universities. Universities, however, were almost entirely male institutions. Women were excluded from formal higher education. Yet literacy was no longer confined to clerical spaces. Urban households with means began educating daughters at home. Some convent schools continued to teach reading and writing. Among wealthy families, private tutors sometimes instructed girls alongside their brothers, though usually with different expectations. Education for boys aimed toward public careers. Education for girls often emphasized religious instruction and household management. Still, even limited literacy altered possibility. A woman who could read could access scripture directly. She could write letters. She could keep household accounts. These were not small changes. Expanding intellectual circles, the Renaissance encouraged renewed interest in classical learning. Humanist scholars emphasized education and the study of ancient texts. Some began to argue that women, too, were capable of intellectual achievement. A small but growing number of educated women emerged from elite families. They wrote poetry, composed letters, participated in intellectual discussions. Their participation remained exceptional, not universal. But their existence challenged assumptions about women's intellectual capacity. Printing amplified these voices. For the first time, ideas could circulate beyond local communities. A written argument could reach distant readers. Access remained limited by class and wealth, but the structure of communication had changed. Education and social expectation. Despite these shifts, social expectations continued to restrict women's public roles. Formal professions, law, university teaching, high-level government, remained closed. Marriage still defined most women's social identity. Inheritance customs continued to vary by region. But education began to create a new kind of agency. An educated woman could influence her children's learning. She could correspond with relatives about political matters. She could participate in religious reform movements. Literacy strengthened voice, even when formal authority remained limited. Slow transformation, expansion of printed material did not immediately produce equality. Change was gradual, incremental, uneven across regions. In some countries, reform movements encouraged broader literacy, including among women. In others, traditional structures remained firm, but the foundation was shifting. For centuries, women's authority had operated primarily within household, convent. A state court now, intellectual space began to open, slowly, beyond those walls. The next chapter will focus on one of the clearest examples of this shift. A woman who used the printed word to argue directly for women's education and rights. Not in rebellion, but through reasoned writing. The story moves toward the late 18th century, where candlelight still flickers, but ideas travel farther than ever before. By the 18th century, Europe had entered what is often called the Age of Enlightenment. Philosophers debated reason, liberty, and the structure of government. Political revolutions reshaped nations. Printed pamphlets circulated widely. Conversations about rights became central to public life. Yet many of these discussions focused primarily on men. Education for boys expanded. Citizenship was debated, but women's formal political rights remained restricted. Within this context, a new development emerged. Some women began to write directly about their position in society. One of the most influential voices was Mary Wilson. In 1792, she published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Her argument was structured and reasoned. She did not call for sudden upheaval. She argued that women should receive the same education as men. Her reasoning was direct. If society expected women to be rational companions and responsible mothers, they required proper education. Her work did not immediately transform law, but it articulated clearly what had long developed gradually. Women's intellectual capacity was equal. Limiting education limited society itself. Writing as agency for centuries, women had exercised influence within households, convents, and courts. Now, writing became a more visible tool. Printed books allowed arguments to reach wider audiences. Educated women corresponded across national borders. Salons hosted gatherings for discussion, sometimes included female participants as organizers and contributors. Still, participation depended heavily on class and access. Working women continued to labor within economic structures similar to earlier centuries. But among intellectual circles, the question of women's rights entered open debate. This marked a significant shift. For much of history, women's roles were defined by custom. Now, those customs were being examined in print. Rights defined in language, the Enlightenment emphasized reason and universal principles. If rights were universal, some asked, why should they exclude women? These questions did not lead to immediate political equality. Voting rights, property reforms, and legal independence would develop slowly over the next centuries, but the foundation was laid in argument. Language matters. Once rights are defined in writing, they can be discussed, revised, challenged. For the first time in many regions, women were not only participating within existing structures, they were publicly questioning those structures. Continuity and change. It is important to remember that this shift did not erase earlier roles. Women continued to manage households, raise children, operate businesses, participate in community life. What changed was visibility. Advocacy entered the public sphere. Formal discussion of rights became part of intellectual culture. This did not replace earlier forms of agency. It built upon them. The ability to argue for education rested on centuries of demonstrated capability. The capacity to write rested on earlier access to literacy through convents and private instruction. Each stage in history prepared the next. As we move into the next chapter, we will see how those written arguments slowly translated into institutional change. The first doors began to open. Universities, professional fields, educational reform. Progress remained uneven, but recognition began to follow. Participation. The long evolution of rights continued. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, arguments about women's education had begun to circulate widely. They did not overturn institutions overnight, but they changed expectations. Gradually, in parts of Europe and North America, educational reforms began to include girls more systematically. Primary schooling expanded. Literacy rates improved. Families who once saw little purpose in educating daughters began to reconsider. Quattro at first education for girls focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, and moral instruction. Higher education remained closed in most regions. Universities were still male institutions. Professional careers, law, medicine, government, largely excluded women. But pressure for access increased. Some institutions slowly opened limited pathways. In certain cities, women were admitted to lectures, though not always granted full degrees. In other cases, separate colleges for women were founded. These developments were cautious and gradual, yet they marked a structural shift. For centuries, women's education had depended on private means, convent instruction, or informal tutoring. Now, institutional education began, slowly, to acknowledge women as students. Professional boundaries. Access to education did not immediately translate into equal professional opportunity. Many fields remained resistant. Medical schools were reluctant to admit women. Legal institutions barred them from practice. Scientific societies excluded them from membership, yet women persisted. Some studied privately, some published under pseudonyms. Some worked alongside fathers or husbands in laboratories, workshops, or clinics. Their contributions were sometimes recorded under male names. But participation continued. Each small entry into a profession set precedent for the next. Teaching as a pathway. One profession opened more readily than others. Teaching. As literacy expanded, the demand for teachers increased. Women became central to primary education. Teaching was seen as an extension of caregiving, socially acceptable within prevailing norms. This perception both limited and enabled. It restricted women to certain roles, but it also granted access to paid employment outside the home. Economic independence, even modest, altered social dynamics. A woman earning income possessed a degree of financial agency that earlier centuries rarely allowed. Legal reform and property rights alongside educational change. Legal reforms began to address property ownership. In some regions, laws were revised to allow married women to retain control over inherited property. These reforms developed gradually throughout the 19th century. They did not establish full equality. This was a significant conceptual change. For much of history, a woman's legal identity had merged with her husband's upon marriage. Now, reform movements argued for separate legal standing. The language of rights became more precise. Contracts, inheritance, guardianship, all subject to review. recognition following participation. It is important to notice the pattern across centuries. Participation often came first. Recognition followed later. Women had long contributed to agriculture, estate management, healing, education, and governance in informal or conditional ways. Now, institutions began slowly to acknowledge what had already been demonstrated in practice. The opening of educational doors did not erase inequality, but it marked an irreversible shift. Once a door is opened even slightly, it is difficult to close completely. As the 19th century advanced, debates about suffrage, citizenship, and political representation would intensify, but those developments rest upon foundations built over centuries. The evolution of rights was not sudden. It was layered, from seedkeeper to estate manager, to midwife, to queen mother, to writer, to teacher. Each stage prepared the next. In our final chapters, we step back and consider the full arc of this long transformation, from ancient reverence to institutional reform, from symbolic presence to legal recognition. The river of change has been steady, and it continues to flow. We have traveled across many centuries, from early farming valleys to Bronze Age palaces, to Roman law, to medieval cloisters and castles, to printing presses and classrooms. Now we pause, not to rush forward, but to look back. History rarely moves in a straight line. It moves like a river, sometimes narrowing, sometimes widening, sometimes flowing beneath the surface before emerging again. Ancient foundations in early agricultural societies. Women's roles were closely tied to survival. They planted seeds, processed grain, preserved food. There were no written legal codes defining rights. Authority was rooted in necessity. In some Bronze Age cultures, women appeared visibly in religious art and ceremony. Spiritual presence was acknowledged. Yet as formal law developed, rights became more structured and often more limited. Symbolic reverence did not always translate into civic equality. Law and structure under Roman law. Women could own property and manage estates under certain conditions. Legal identity became clearer. At the same time, guardianship and exclusion from political office limited formal authority. When the medieval world formed, rights shifted again. Feudal systems prioritized land inheritance through male lines. Marriage defined legal identity. Yet within those structures, women governed estates, managed households, and in some cases ruled as regents. In convents, literacy and administrative authority flourished. In villages, economic participation remained constant. The structure narrowed in some ways, expanded in others. The pattern of conditional authority crescera. One pattern appears repeatedly. Women's authority was often conditional. It depended on marital status, class, widowhood, religious vocation. Guardianship of heirs widows frequently possessed more legal independence than married women. Abbesses held more institutional authority than many laywomen. Queens governed most securely when acting on behalf of sons. Rights were rarely universal. They were situational. Context shaped possibility. Education as turning point. With the expansion of literacy and printing, a shift occurred. For much of history, participation came without formal recognition. Women worked, managed, healed, advised, but their rights were not framed as universal principles. The Enlightenment introduced the language of rights. Arguments were written, published, debated. Education became central. Once women gained greater access to learning, they gained new tools. Writing, public discourse, legal argument. The conversation moved from custom to policy. Expansion without uniformity. It would be inaccurate to describe this evolution as constant improvement. Some eras allowed more property flexibility than others. Some regions were more restrictive. Progress occurred unevenly across geography and class. A noblewoman in one century might wield more influence than a working woman in a later century. Rights expanded gradually, but never uniformly. Still, over time, legal recognition increased. Educational access widened. Institutional barriers began to shift. The language of equality entered law. Continuity beneath changed despite structural transformation. Certain elements remained constant. Across centuries, Women sustained households. They transmitted knowledge. They shaped family networks. They participated in economic life. They influenced political outcomes through alliance and counsel. These roles did not disappear. They evolved. What changed most visibly was recognition, from unrecorded labor to acknowledged administration, to printed argument, to institutional reform. The river widened. As we reached the final chapter, we returned to the central idea. Beyond the visible record of kings and battles, there's always been another current. Not hidden, but often overlooked. We step now into our closing reflection. We begin with a simple question. Have we mistaken silence for absence? Across centuries, the record of history has often focused on visible authority, crowns, wars, laws, and public declarations. But when we look carefully, another pattern becomes clear. Women were never outside history. They were inside its structure. Sometimes at the center, sometimes at the margins, often working within limits, but always present. Presence across eras and early farming communities. Women shaped survival itself. They planted, preserved, and ensured continuity. In Bronze Age societies, they appeared in sacred spaces, visibly linked to ritual life. In Rome, they navigated legal systems that both restricted and enabled property ownership. In late antiquity, they helped build spiritual communities that endured political collapse. In the medieval world, they governed estates, led convents, managed households, and preserved knowledge. In villages, they produced goods essential to economic life. As midwives, they safeguarded birth and lineage. As queens and regents, they protected dynasties. With the rise of print, they entered intellectual debate. With the expansion of education, they stepped into institutions previously closed. Each era imposed structure. Each era allowed adaptation. Rights narrowed in some periods and widened in others, but participation remained continuous. The evolution of rights, the story of women's rights, is not one of sudden revolution. It is a long progression, from informal authority rooted in survival, to structured but conditional legal recognition, to intellectual argument for equality, to institutional reform. Recognition followed participation. Language followed experience. Legal reform followed centuries of demonstrated capability. This evolution was uneven. It depended on geography, class, and political climate. But over time, the idea that women were entitled to education, property protection, and civic recognition became more firmly embedded in law. The veil was not lifted in a single moment. It thinned gradually. The quiet foundation is what becomes clear. Looking across this long history is that visible power is only one form of influence. Fields must still be planted. Children must still be raised. Knowledge must still be passed forward. Institutions must still be sustained. Throughout every century we explored, women carried responsibilities essential to continuity, often without formal acknowledgement, sometimes with conditional authority, eventually with increasing recognition. Returning to the present, if we listen closely to the past, we hear patterns rather than isolated events. We see that history is built not only by those who rule openly, but by those who maintain stability quietly. The story of women's rights and roles is not separate from history. It is interwoven with it. From ancient valleys to modern institutions, the thread remains unbroken. Beyond the veil of loud events lies a steady current of participation, and that current has shaped the world as surely as any decree or conquest. Thank you for walking through these centuries with me. If you found calm in this journey, and if you would like to continue exploring the quieter sides of history, I'd invite you to subscribe and join us again. Until next time, rest well, historian.